The best and the worst hunters for beginner players, let's go. At the very bottom we have Mad Eyes. Mad Eyes is probably one of the most complicated hunters in the whole of Identity V. His walls may be simple to use at the beginning. To be able to play him, you really do need to be able to know the maps perfectly, because the fact that you need to be able to know it from above and also from below, so you know exactly where survivors will be heading, which areas you can block off, and also where to look, so you know when you're looking at a wiggling cipher machine, which machine you need to be looking at so you can see that cipher from above. It's also very important to mention that Mad Eyes has a very difficult strategy because you need to be able to manage the walls and also normal chase. His strategies come in two different types, using either the walls to chase and then going after them, or first chasing and then trying to use the walls to pressure the map. Both of these strategies are very difficult to manage, and being able to use the walls whilst chasing someone is pretty much impossible if you're a new player, because you have no idea where they just went. Next up we have Dream Witch. It's slightly easier to play than Mad Eyes, but not by much. She has very difficult abilities to manage because she has to create multiple different versions of herself and send them in different directions to be able to chase survivors. This means that you need to be able to be aware of where you are, where your main body is, also where all of your other copies of yourself are. And you also need to know how to send them off in certain directions to be able to cut survivors off. This means that you need to know the map very well, similar to Mad Eyes, because you need to be able to know where survivors are going to be going and where your leeches are going to suffer the most. I must say that Dream Witch doesn't really have any good chase abilities either, unless you actually master her properly. But if you do master her properly, she is insanely strong and probably the strongest hunter in all of Identity V. Clerk has way too many abilities for a beginner to remember. Even for players who've been playing the game for such a long time, her abilities are very confusing and difficult to manage overall. The fact that she has so many different buttons means that she's very difficult to play on PC, especially if you're trying to play this for the first time, and on mobile it's a little bit easier, but still there are tons of buttons to press. Her abilities aren't even that easy to understand. That makes her even more difficult for beginners to comprehend what they even have to do with this character. She has the ability to record, play and rewind abilities to be able to undo pilots, redo pilots, stop windows, hit survivors, not hit survivors. It's very, very complicated. Also, she suffers really badly in the early game, and if you don't know how to use her abilities well, you just won't have any abilities that are useful for you. As most survivors will notice, that the early game is the most important because it does take a long time to catch survivors when you're not used to chasing survivors in general. So having a bad early game means that you'll probably never get to late game or even get abilities for the late game. One of the benefits she has though is that survivors have no clue how to play against her because she's so complicated, and her utility, once mastered, is incredibly powerful. Next up we have Breaking Wheel. Breaking Wheel is one of the best hunters in Identity V, but for beginners he is incredibly difficult because of his main gimmick. This is his wheel form. Wheel form is really difficult to control and probably one of the most difficult movement control abilities in the whole game. This will take tons and tons of hours of practice to be able to get under control, and if you don't get this under control, then you're going to suffer as a consequence because the rest of his abilities are connected to him using his wheel form correctly. Especially when you aren't very familiar with the maps and also with kiting routes, it makes it very difficult for you to navigate, and you'll probably navigate around in wheel form and you'll probably find yourself spending more time stuck against the wall than you will actually be chasing survivors. But once you've mastered him, he is incredibly strong, possibly one of the strongest or the strongest hunter in the game, up there with Dream Witch 2. Okay, let's move up into the next tier. This is the Bad Choice tier. At the bottom of Bad Choice tier, we have Naiad. Naiad's abilities may seem very powerful and simplistic on the surface, but they do require a lot of different things. First of all, they require kiting route knowledge. If you don't know how survivors will react and where they will go, then it's very difficult for you to make correct placements for water areas. And of course, you don't have any other abilities except for normal hitting if you can't get water on these survivors. Being able to predict which direction they're going to go in or which areas you need to be covering so they're stuck in this water area and can't abuse pilots and windows correctly means that if you don't know this, you're going to suffer really badly. I would say that she's also quite difficult to learn as you understand where to use your harpoon and when not to use it. This may seem a little bit weird, but it's actually very difficult to know when you should be using it and when you shouldn't. One of the benefits that she has though over everyone who's in the lower tiers is that she can deal a ton of damage, and not only to one player player, but to multiple targets at the same time. She also has probably one of the best camping abilities in the game, and once mastered, she can be very strong in mid to high tiers. Next up, we have Hellember. Hellember's abilities, although he is the first hunter that you get in Identity V, are probably one of the most complicated abilities in the game, and I don't know why this is the first character that NetEase gives you. He has so many different abilities that he can use, and all of them depend on certain different aspects that are not really clear and explained in the game very well, in my opinion, means that he is very difficult for someone just to pick up and learn quickly. He also really suffers, and one of the reasons why he's not strong in meta at the moment is that he has a really bad early game. And as I've mentioned previously, if a hunter does bad in the early game, beginners are going to suffer the most because they won't get their later tier presence abilities. He also requires a lot of kiting route knowledge and survivor tendency knowledge, so you can use your abilities to send your Ember copy into the right areas, using it at the correct time to be able to cut off certain escape routes and stop survivors from doubling back. One of the benefits he has though is that his abilities are really strong when used correctly, and he has very strong camping when his tricks have been learned. Again, he takes quite a bit of mastery. Bloody Queen is up next. Her abilities are quite simple to understand, kind of, but they are very difficult to use, especially if you're a beginner player, because you need to be able to chase in reverse, see things at a distance, know survivor tendencies, and more or less judge where the survivor is compared to your mirror when you use it. This makes her very complicated to use, but very powerful in the right hands. You also need to have quite good map knowledge, so you can quickly use your mirror in the right directions to be able to hit survivors who might be kind of coming into rescue and stuff like that. Once you've mastered her though, her map pressure is incredibly strong, and her anti-kite is very powerful too. Next up, we've got Guard 26. His abilities may seem quite simple, but they do require quite a lot of kiting route knowledge. Being able to place the bombs at the right positions and being able to use them at the right times will be the difference between you actually downing a survivor or you just chasing behind them, dropping bombs and looking like you're spamming them for the sake of spamming them. Bomb placements do take quite a lot of practice, although they may seem simple at the beginning, and there are some different strategies and placements that you need to learn on certain areas, and of course being able to predict where the survivor is going to go next so you can cut off that kiting route is really important. His camping though is incredibly strong and probably one of the strongest in the game too, so once you've mastered him and you've got someone down, it does snowball from there. And his chase is really good once you've got a lot of practice, but he requires a ton of different pieces of knowledge and a ton of practice, and makes him very difficult for beginners. Wax Artist, again, seems to have very simple abilities, and his full presence is incredibly powerful, but he really suffers on different types of maps. Some maps are great for him, some maps are absolutely horrible for him. Anything with walls is bad for him. He is quite rough to play in the early game. Beginner survivors might suffer against him a little bit. He just feels a little bit too inconsistent at actually getting chases, and once survivors realize what his abilities are, they will pretty much work out how to avoid his barrage of wax shooting. As I mentioned before, his early game is bad, but also his early camp is pretty bad, and he doesn't get very strong until he's at full presence. So you pretty much just have to waste a lot of time in the early game that is something that's really important for beginners to then hopefully get to the late game and be at full power. Feaster is up next, and he requires a ton of practice because you need to be able to know exactly where to place your tentacles, exactly at what distance, when to use them, and use a lot of mind gaming. Kiting routes are also sort of necessary for him, so this means that you need to know exactly where a survivor is going to go next so you can place a tentacle in the right position. His camping is incredibly strong and one of the strongest in the game, and he is incredibly difficult to kite once you've mastered him, but his difficulty of use and the fact that you need to have quite a lot of map knowledge and kiting knowledge does make him pretty hard for beginners. Smiley Face is a little bit higher up than Feaster, having simple abilities to understand at the beginning, but he's difficult to use when you're trying to deal with tight kiting survivors. Tight kiting is when the survivors are running away from you in tight areas and are not trying to go long distances to avoid you. His rockets take a lot of practice to use, similar to Breaking Wheel, and if you don't master this, this can be a little bit of a problem, but it is a little bit easier to use in quite close quarters. Once you have mastered him, he has really good map pressure, and this means that he can go to different places in the beginning and at the early game to be able to try and find the survivor that he really wants to find and stop Cypher Machine progress once he's got someone down. Eva Reptilian is up next with super simple abilities to understand and to learn and to kind of to put in practice. Unless you're playing on mobile, he is much better on PC if you want to learn him. Super early in your Identity V career, most people will be pretty easy to predict and you'll be able to slam on top of them pretty easily. But once you get against players that have a tiny bit more knowledge of the game, it will require a lot of mind gaming and a lot of kiting route knowledge, because you need to be able to decide if you're going to crash now or if they're going to double back and avoid you. That means that he's a very complicated character to use effectively. His camping can be good sometimes, but also can be absolutely terrible, so this makes him a little bit inconsistent in the camping area, but on the good side, his mobility around the map is okay. Violinist has insanely powerful abilities, and once you've got the hang of them, they can be really strong, but they take quite a bit of practice to get used to. He is really strong in the late game, having a ton of different utility and ways of dealing damage. His camping is also very good once you've mastered him, but he does require a lot of map knowledge and kiting knowledge for you to know exactly where survivors are going to go so you can use your notes efficiently. He also doesn't have much map pressure, that is one of his main issues. Later in your career, you'll notice that he requires quite a bit of mind gaming, as survivors won't directly vault things and might wait out the note. Let's move into the next tier, the good choice tier. At the bottom of this tier, we've got Photographer, that is great for slowing down the match because his abilities make Cypher Machines take much longer to do. This is really good for a beginner because it gives them more time to be able to chase, to camp, and just to manage things in general. But one of his main issues is that his abilities are very complicated, and there are tons of different interactions involved in using his abilities effectively. If you understand all of them, you can be a menace, but if you have no idea what's going on, you'll feel like survivors are just healing up at the weird different time intervals and you're not doing anything specific. He seems okay for chase, but he hasn't really got anything for the early game chase that once again makes him suffer a little bit if you are a beginner player. Next up, we've got Axe Boy, and he has probably one of the biggest amount of utility in the game. His fireballs take quite a lot of practice to use, but even if you do miss them, you don't get nothing from them. You do get a speed boost. Like I said, all of his abilities are useful, even if you use them incorrectly. It is something that is really beneficial for him, especially if you are a beginner player, because it does give you a little bit more space to make some errors. One of the reasons why he's not in the highest tier is because he can be countered if you're playing against a knowledgeable team that are slowly taking apart your trees. Soulweaver is next. She is one of the fastest hunters in the game, and this is really hard to kite if you're a survivor who's a beginner, and as a hunter this can feel really fun to zoom around the map and hit survivors really quickly. She does take some map knowledge though, and quite a lot of trick learning, so you can know exactly where to place your webs, and also to be able to counter certain kiting routes more efficiently, and knowing exactly when to use your webs as well, because you don't want to use up all of your webbing. She has quite good anti-rescue too once you've learned the strategy of how to use her abilities, and she also does counter quite a lot of different survivors' abilities, being able to avoid completely chairing in some cases that can be good against harassers who are trying to stop you from picking up the survivor. Wu Chang is a little bit higher up than Soulweaver, having really strong abilities, especially in the late game, but he suffers in the beginning. In the beginning, he doesn't have any abilities, and although his hitbox in his white form may seem really powerful, you'll quickly see the limitations for it. Black form being the best for chases because it has the best stats for pallet breaking and window vaulting, but the fact is that he just gets kited in the early game, and especially if you're not very good at base chasing, he can be quite a problem to play with. But if you do manage to get to full presence, then he has insanely great map pressure, and he has strong abilities that can counter the rescue, the chase, and different aspects of the game. But he can be a little bit rough when you're going against a voice comm team. Sculptor's up next. Her abilities are really strong and deal tons of damage really quickly, but they do take just a little bit of practice to use efficiently. As I said, you can down survivors really quickly, and in the late game, she really is a menace and can quickly eliminate survivors coming to rescue or just trying to escape you in general. She has the ability to be able to do great map pressure by being able to down survivors from a distance, and once you've actually got the hang of more or less how her abilities move and feel, you'll quickly be able to get people down, meaning that she is one of the best picks for for a beginner. Ripper has super simple abilities to use, being able to walk really fast and to be able to shoot a foggy blade out of your hand every 12 seconds or so. Inexperienced survivors can't kite him since they can't see him. That is one of the best things for a beginner hunter to use efficiently, because it just means they can quickly deal with survivors that have no idea what they're doing in the game. And his foggy blade is quite easy to use, but sometimes without some practice you will miss them. One of his main issues does come down to the fact that he doesn't have any map pressure, and he does get Cypher Rush though, so this is why he is not at the top. Next up, we've got Undead. His basic abilities are easy to understand, although he does get a little bit more complicated in some of his interactions. When a beginner hunter picks him up, they'll quickly understand what they're meant to do with him. Just chase and hit people. Lower tier survivors have no idea what they're doing against this hunter and will quickly fall apart as soon as a couple of survivors are down, and they have no idea if they're meant to go and pick up and why this hunter's not even chairing the person in the first place. His immunity to stuns can make some survivors that are a pain for beginners not too much of an issue to deal with, and he has quite good map pressure too, but he does require some kiting knowledge, and knowledgeable survivors can counter him, so when you climb up the tiers a little bit, you will suffer a little bit against certain smart survivors. The final tier, the S tier, the best for beginners. At the bottom of this tier, we've got Geisha, super easy abilities to understand. You'll quickly realize that newer survivors don't know how to kite her at all, and this might even continue into mid tiers too. She has decent anti-rescue abilities, being able to double hit survivors coming in, although it can be a little bit inconsistent, but she does require a little bit of practice. She also has really good mobility that can make up for some mistakes if you do lose track of survivors. Nightmare is up next with really easy abilities to use. His attacks can actually auto-target survivors, so if you're not very good at aiming your attacks, well, Nightmare's the best pick for you. His teleport ability means that you can get around the map if you made a mistake and didn't go in the right direction, or if you just want to pressure someone on the map and get Cypher Machines slowed down by kicking people off the Cypher Machines. Once you get some knowledgeable players, you will notice that you'll get kited quite badly, so it does take a tiny bit of practice once you get a little bit further up the tiers. In second place, we've got Gamekeeper with abilities that are incredibly strong against new players, being able to hook them over windows, hook them at a distance, or hook them anytime, anywhere. His traps are really useful for countering survivors that are looping in certain areas, as you can quickly just instantly negate those loops by putting a trap down by a window. His hooks have multiple utilities, as you can use them just to hook survivors, or also to move around the map quickly and catch up to survivors and slow them down if they're in the area when you impact into the object. So this means that he just has really strong abilities, especially against beginner players. In first place, we have Disciple, with easy abilities to understand, but with incredible utility. You being able to stun survivors, negate their abilities in some cases can be super powerful, negate harassing by dropping the cats next to you when you're picking up a survivor. Most survivors will not know how to go against her. She has very easy abilities to use in chase, and they are very efficient even in the early game. I think after a couple of matches you'll have quickly got the hang of how to use them if you are a beginner player. And her anti-rescue is absolutely amazing when you've learned a couple of tricks. And it's not actually that difficult to use, and most survivors will just not be able to rescue against you. Are you still having issues playing Hunter and you want to get a little bit better? Then you need to watch this video here and you'll learn a couple more tips and tricks for you to improve as a Hunter.